Good evening and welcome to our TheraZoom webinar entitled The Meron Tragedy, When You're Here and Your Child is in Israel. I'm David Liebtag, OHEL's School Services Director, and I will be serving as your moderator this evening. The painful tragedy in Meron last week on Lag BaOmer has traumatized our people. In one of the holiest cities in Israel, on one of the most joyous days on the Jewish calendar, 45 precious souls were tragically taken from us. Many were injured, physically and mentally. The incongruity of the tragedy has left us in shock. Fathers, sons, siblings, friends, adults and children, Jews from every walk of life perished on this day. There are many questions with few answers. It is normal to ask questions, certainly within Jewish tradition. Why? What? How? We try to make sense of the unthinkable. For parents who have children studying in Israel, it is a particularly emotional period. The natural inclination to hug our children at a time like this, to comfort them and ourselves, is not possible. How do we manage the strong feelings and anxiety? To guide us through this sea of emotions, we are fortunate to have one of the leading experts in trauma, Dr. Norman Blumenthal, to share his thoughts with us. Dr. Blumenthal is a clinical psychologist and OHEL's Director of Trauma and Crisis Response. He has been in the forefront of helping families deal with the pain of grief and loss and has presented hundreds of presentations, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has brought much consolation and solace to many. Tonight's webinar is an important component of OHEL's mission to care for the emotional, developmental, and mental health needs of our community. So before we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge UJ Federation for their support during this time. I would also like to thank OHEL's leadership, led by co-presidents Mel Zachter and Jay Kestenbaum, for their guidance and encouragement, as well as OHEL's CEO, David Mandel, for his professional leadership. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. This session is going to be recorded and will be available on the OHEL website in approximately 1 week. We will have some time for questions, so please submit your question in the Q&A function or the chat option located on the bottom of the screen. Finally, we ask that you complete a short questionnaire that will appear in your browser after the program is over to provide feedback and help us plan for future webinars. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, David. Rabbi Liebtag was very gracious in thanking everybody, but he reminds me very much of the comedian who said that he's going to rewrite his autobiography to include himself. So I want to take a moment to thank Rabbi Liebtag for all his work and making this possible, as well as our new administrator, Yid Selman, who's online as well here, who's also helped along with all of the OHEL staff that's made it possible, as well as UJ. I also want to say, in by way of introduction, that we're doing everything we do, and anything we do now should be in memory of and as a blessing to the deceased, to the 45 neshamos souls that perished during this horrific event, should serve as a refuah shlema, speedy recovery for those who've been injured, and for those who've been injured both physically, injured in their body, and injured in their soul, and those who are suffering, and that, of course, maybe includes many of us, as a result of these unthinkable events. And we all hope and pray that the kindness we see and dedication of organizations like OHEL, of the participants who are taking time during the busy evening to try to see how it can be helpful to the children, should ensure that we should be spared any kind of future suffering like this again. Where our focus today is going to be on helping very specific piece of it, of this tragedy, which is helping our children who are 6,000 miles away. How do we help our children who are currently in Israel? And this would probably cover, I would say, let's say 3 categories of children. It may be our children who were at Meron and may have actually been in the vicinity of this terrible human avalanche and are recovering themselves from physical injuries. It may have been children who were at Meron, were spared being at that exact site, but witnessed something so horrible. I got a call from someone, I got so many calls, it's hard to remember when, but sometime during this week, from Israel, a young man who is studying in Israel, who, I guess it was divine providence, but on his way, the van on his way to Meron was sidelined because there was a fender bender or something, and they couldn't make it to Meron. So they went to Safat, and they actually were praying there by the graves of great people, and they watched it from Safat, and said the number of ambulances, the red flashing lights, that he has a trigger response when he sees any ambulance, and he was miles away and spared. But those who may have been in the vicinity and seen it, and then those who were just in Israel, even if they weren't in Meron, the closer you are to a tragedy, whether the closeness is physical proximity or whether the closeness is proximity in terms of station in life and age, the more you're going to feel that trauma. So we're here in the States, our children are in Israel and are being impacted in many in very profound ways, and how can we be of assistance to them? And again, I welcome questions in the chat and the Q&A, or comments and suggestions that some of you may have that I may not have addressed. It's customary now, certainly in the Orthodox Jewish community, that our children go to Israel to study religious studies. In some subsets of the community, it's the gap year between high school and college, and for some it's a little bit later on, but a period of time to engage in spiritual pursuits, and in a very natural place, which is Israel. And I'm sure I share the sentiments of others, and I know what it was like for me when I sent my children there, that it was an intense ambivalence. On the one hand, thrilled that they had this opportunity, an opportunity that some of our forebears couldn't even remotely dream about. They had opportunity to engage in religious study, opportunity to spend a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe even more in the land of Israel. But at the same time, they're apart from us. They're leaving us. They're not leaving us for even 8 weeks of summer camp or a 1 week vacation, midwinter vacation. They're leaving us for a year. And although it has become far more customary to visit during the year, for parents to go visit children in Israel if they can afford it, or for children to come back, let's say for Passover, certainly this year, with the pandemic and the limitations in terms of travel and entry into Israel, or coming back from Israel, it really was good. It was with that anticipation that's going to be a year apart. So it really was, it's difficult and painful. And then of course, when something of this magnitude happens, it makes it all the more disconcerting. I will tell you personally that I believe 2 of my children did their 2 years in Israel during the Intifada. And I'm not saying it's identical, but it was with that same heavy heart and worry that I experienced my children being apart and being in Israel. And this was a traumatic year. This, with the corona, it has been a very difficult, traumatic year in many dimensions, many losses, financial setbacks, and worry about one's health and well-being. And in the context of that trauma, to have a traumatic event like this makes it all the more difficult. I often mention what's the mathematics of trauma. That the mathematics of trauma is that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, 2 + 2 = 8, 2 + 2 + 2 = 28. That trauma, on the heels of trauma, it grows exponentially. And in this context, I often quote my mother, who was a Holocaust survivor, who had a treasure trove of Yiddish sayings. And one of them was that when a poor man has a hernia, there's a pimple on it. And that when there's already things are difficult and stressful, to have an event like this occur makes it all the more complicated. And I think there's another point, which is that we're a very closely connected, intertwined people. And even here, and for that matter, even those in Israel who may have been a little more, we all know somebody. We either know somebody directly, we know somebody through somebody. And frankly, if we didn't, we know them well now, because the stories of the victims are abounding, and we have become almost intimately familiar with people whom we have never met. So we have this responsibility of trying to comfort, trying to help our children. And again, while they're 6,000 miles apart, it's hard enough to do it when we have them by us, next to us. And how do we do it from such a great distance? So I'm going to go through a few points and then open it up for, again, questions, comments, etc. But please, as we're talking, please feel free to contribute. So what should we do? So first of all, I want to tell you, and this, like, maybe I'm in a unique vantage point to say this, but I have to tell you that I am singularly impressed with the yeshivot, the yeshivas, the seminaries, the institutions where our children are spending their time. I can't say I've heard from all of them, but I've heard directly or secondhand from many, and it's really my impression that they are leaving no stone unturned. I have been in touch with a number of my colleagues in Israel, and they are all visiting the various institutions. They're not visiting them by sort of imposing themselves on them, but they are visiting them they're by invitation. They're being mobilized, and the directors and the program directors and the various teachers are spending sleepless nights and tending to the children in a manner that is both thorough and sensitive. So my first message is to you, and again, when you entrust your child to someone else, it's a huge responsibility, but I think they're rising to the occasion, and from every end of the religious spectrum. I don't think I've ever seen so many institutions, you know, all many of whom would not have more naturally sought out the assistance of mental health professionals, but are seeking them out at this point. So that's point number one. Trust the institution, and rest assured is that as far as I can tell, and I think others will say as well, they are doing what they have to address the well-being of our children. The other thing is that anytime, and this applies in this situation, and certainly applies when you're trying to help your children long distance, it's the old metaphor of putting the oxygen on yourself before you put it on your child. Make sure you're okay. Address it yourself, put the oxygen on yourself first, and then address it with your children. There was a very famous psychiatrist known as Harry Stack Sullivan. Harry Stack Sullivan is the founder of the American School of Psychiatry. And he used to have a line when he would train residents in psychiatry. He used to say, when you're doing therapy, there should be only one anxious person in the room, preferably not the therapist. And the same thing is true when we're helping our children. If you want our children to manage the stress and distress of these events, you have to manage them yourself. Now, managing them doesn't mean that you're not upset, and managing doesn't mean that you're not worried and aching for those who are injured, for the families of those who had died. This doesn't mean to become unemotional, but there's a difference between an emotional that is controlling you and you who is in charge of your emotions. I often reference, it was after the Sassoon fire, that terrible fire, I think it's about 5 years ago now, where 6 out of 7 children perished in Brooklyn, that the most common question I got asked afterwards was, can I cry in front of my children? Can I cry in front of my students? And the answer that I gave, and some of you have listened to me before, may have heard this, you can't shriek and scream and be out of control, but you can cry, and crying is actually a very good lesson, a very sort of a teachable moment, that's how we respond. So first, face it yourself. I mean, obviously, when this happened, you need to reach out and touch base with your children. But as we're coping is a process, and the process that's an ongoing process, be sort of rest assured that I mean, not rest assured, but try to make sure you're coping or you're processing it, and before you even help your child. Now, when something terrible happens like this, if God forbid something like this happened, let's say here, and when your children are living in close proximity, one of the things you want to do is just be with your child. You just want to hold your child and touch your child. And that's very, very important, because so much of the comfort that we provide to anyone who is suffering is just our sheer presence. I was just giving a class I train the Yeshiva University students in trauma and in bereavement. And there was a very seasoned rabbi who joined us for this class. And he reiterated the point that we mentioned to these prospective rabbis again and again when we talk about families who are sitting shiva is just your presence. Just being there is a source of comfort, given who you are and what you represent. I know that the principal of the school, one of the victims just graduated from, through Herculean efforts, it left tonight for Israel for a 36-hour stay, for no other reason, just to hug the kids and to be with them. And I have no doubt that they're just seeing him walk into their study hall or walk into their school will already be a source of comfort. But it's very hard when you're so far away. So, and by the way, this also speaks into very important to remember, and I think we all know this, but it has to be reiterated. Our presence and everything I talk about is not to get rid of the horror and the trauma. You can't do that. We're very governed by sort of a medical model. And in the medical model, if you have an infection, you take an antibiotic to get rid of the infection. And that may work with infections. But when it comes with life events, we don't get rid of life events. We gain mastery over them. We integrate them into our life narrative, into our psyche. And our task for ourselves and for our children, as we talk about all these methods and ways in which we're going to help them, is not that they should delete it and not have any kind of association with the horrific events that they witnessed or experienced close hand, but for them to work it into who they are and to understand it and master it. It's interesting, I was doing a parenting group for a group of parents, friends of one of the victims from Meron, and one of the parents asked me a very good question. He said, I'm worried that my child's year will be defined by this tragedy. That whenever he thinks, or whenever people ask him when he was in Israel, say, oh, that was the year of Meron. And what can we do to prevent that? And my answer, I'm not sure everybody will agree, but my answer was it should. It should define the year. Now, defining the year doesn't mean that every time he thinks about his year in Israel, he's going to have that shudder of anxiety. But what should govern his year is not only the mishaps and tragedy, but the uniting of people, the work done to help us grow and master these horrific events. It is going to and it probably should define the year. So again, we have to deal with, you need to hold your child in present, but we can't, it's not possible. So first of all, and I hope this won't be taken the wrong way, but thank God for technology. Thank God. Imagine this year of COVID, and then imagine having a child in Israel with all this going on, and we didn't have Zoom, FaceTime, Skype, or I'm not advertising any particular brand, but this capacity to actually see each other as we are doing now and connect at least via voice and image, as it's not be the same as that holding and that hugging, but it does at least help. And there's an art to connecting on an emotional level to via Zoom or via the internet, which we as mental health professionals have been trying to master and perfect this past year. But you become hyper-focused on certain aspects of communication. That's going to be important in terms of working with our children as well. I have found, and I'll tell you my own personal life, is that I've been working very hard on my vocabulary, on my words, but particularly words that capture emotions, because I don't have that nonverbal communication as effectively when I'm speaking to patients or even family members via the medium of Zoom, let's say. So therefore, the descriptive vocabulary, the metaphors that I can learn, and I found that I'm working on myself and developing them, because they're ways that we can give over that emotional expression via this medium. Facial expressions become all the more important, because that's all basically the person sees. Even the emojis, which can give over some sort of sense of emotion, are being used so that in order that we can give over that emotion and that care. And so we have to use this medium as ideally as possible. I see there's some questions in chats. I'm going to stop for a minute when I get a chance, but maybe now's a good time. Let me take a quick look at some of the questions and chats, and then I'll see. By the way, let me just say quickly that you can. I'm not sure if you have control who you open up. So I'm certainly not going to make it clear who asked this question in case people want anonymity. Okay. Okay, so somebody talked about a child who was there, not near the actual tragedy, but got the sense of what was going on and heard from someone who had ventured over what had been happening, and she, and the parents are asking if she's okay, and she keeps saying she's fine, which is a great question and a very common question we're getting asked: is she really fine? And so I would have addressed that a little bit later, but I'll address it now. There's no one right response to trauma. The art of finding the right response to trauma is for the person to do what works for them. So, for example, I know that my friend and colleague, Dr. Pelkvis, likes to talk a lot about what he calls attenders and distractors. That some people deal with trauma by focusing on the trauma, and some people deal with trauma by avoiding it. And the truth of the matter is that for the best thing for an attender to do is to attend, and the best thing for a distractor to do is to distract, because that's what works for them. So there's not a one size fits all. We all have different ways of coping, and it's entirely possible that that's her nature, that she's able to cope, or she's able to manage, and that's no slight to her. Just like we differ on all sorts of dimensions, we differ on our reactivity and to the extent to which we will focus necessarily on something of this magnitude. So if she says she's okay, and by the way, I'm going to say something else also, nobody knows her better than you. And you're going to know if that I'm okay is really coming from inside of her, or if that I'm okay is because she wants to spare you any kind of heartache, or if because she's being told that that's what you're supposed to say. So listen to the nuance of language, listen to the voice tone, to rest assured, to be comforted that she's okay. One more thing is important to know is that trauma is tricky, because sometimes trauma, first of all, is a roller coaster. It's an in and out experience, and some people who were traumatized can have some relief, and the trauma can come back. Sometimes through reminders, through triggers, and sometimes just clearly out of the blue. There's some life events you can't think about all the time, so your brain takes a vacation, and you get away from it and you revisit it. And sometimes there's a dormant period. Sometimes initially people don't respond, sometimes because it's too much, and sometimes because they have to take care of pragmatic matters and they can't focus on the trauma yet. And that when things get better, that's when the trauma hits them. We see that very dramatically in survivors of residential fires. If you know anybody, or if God forbid any of you have lived through a fire, you lose everything. You have to find a place to live. You have to deal with insurance justice. You have to reclaim driver's license, passports, etc. There's a lot of time, a lot of pragmatic issues that you have to go through. And then just about when everything's over and you have a brand new house and you've retrieved all your documents and everything is back to normal, that's when the nightmares begin, because you can't take care of all those practical matters if you're having a trauma response. So that's a possibility as well. But don't just assume because she says she's fine that she's not, that she's lying. It is distinctly possible that she is indeed fine, and that's her nature, or she was sufficiently removed. There could be any number of reasons, but if she says she's fine and your sixth sense about your child says she's telling you the truth, then she is. And she may be very different from you. That's the other problem sometimes. Sometimes an attender gives birth to a distractor, or there's that DNA from that great-grandfather that crept in, and sometimes distractors give birth to attenders, and then sometimes you have to sort of leave yourself and recognize that your child is different. Okay, let me see. There's some other points, questions, and chats. Let me look at the chat. I see something that came into the chat. Okay, someone's asking why this happened, and I think it's beyond the scope of our talk here. I will say that I just came from a class, and someone who was a student of Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik said that the Rav, as we call him, used to say that when it comes to grieving, we don't ask why, we ask what. What do we do? And that's what I think we're going to be focusing on. Okay, how can we encourage a child to move forward and not remain stuck in an early stage of grief and guilt? Okay, so that's also an excellent but very loaded question. Normal grief is progressive. Normal grief moves, moves forward, moves backwards. There's good weeks, there's bad weeks. It's a complicated process. The norm is that grief progresses. Now, by the way, you say about different stages of grief. There is a very famous person, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who had 5 stages of grief, and later she had 7 stages of grief. She made a huge contribution to the field of grief, but the notion that people follow exact stages, predictable stages of grief, not only has not been borne out by research, but Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself uh, took that back and said we can't predict people to go through normal. The people are too complicated. We can't reduce someone's grief to these kind of stages. Each stage is important in of itself, but there is no known. Well, let's put it this way: for the most part, there's no known progression of grief, but grief is progressive. Now, we're not even a week into this, so we can't expect somebody. In fact, there is, if you could use a good laugh, if you want to go on YouTube, there's a Bart Simpson routine. Bart Simpson is informed that he's going to die, and he goes through all 5 stages, Kubler-Ross's 5 stages in 30 seconds. And by the way, I mention this only because you can still pick up brochures today in hospices and other settings where they tell you you're going to go through these 5 stages, which is not the case. But it's still very early. So please don't expect too much. Your child, I'm going to say the odds are very favorable that your child will progress with this. And progress with this means doesn't, quote unquote, getting over it. Progressing means that he or she is going to integrate it into who they are, going to try to understand, they're going to change themselves to manage this painful experience that they were exposed to. Let nature run its course. Now, there are rare instances, not unheard of, but there are rare instances where people do get stuck in grief. Usually there are a host of reasons for that. If that is your sense, whoever asked this question, please reach out to me. We'll discuss it further, because that's the exception, not the rule. And I can be reached through OHIL. I will, in fact, at this point, maybe I will, if I can, or David, if you could just put in my email address so people will know how to reach me. And in terms of guilt, guilt is a fascinating topic. I wasn't going to go into it, but I think the guilt that would be most common here is something we refer to as survivor guilt, especially for those who were in the vicinity or in the midst of that maelstrom of humanity when it happened and somehow survived. And sometimes there is this, I will say, kind of irrational thought that someone was destined to die and somebody else died so that they could live. This was a common response of many Holocaust survivors. And you feel guilty then for surviving. And many of those, and I've spoken to them, who were in that immediate vicinity, and by sheer call it serendipitous, or if we want to call it divine providence, were somehow spared that, thank you, David, somehow spared that horror, are feeling guilty, because why were they spared and why were other people killed? And of course, so many of those people were just such exceptional individuals. So that's a common response, and a fairly normal one, not something that's abnormal. And if your child has survivor guilt, I would tell you, at least in a universal sense, that don't try to talk them out of it. It's not a rational guilt, it's an emotional guilt. And really the approach is say that's how people think. That's a common response. It tends not to linger. It tends to be an early response that does dissipate. But again, I would say to you, for the person who asked that question, that if after a while that survivor guilt perseveres, then contact me and we'll address it. Okay, next question. Okay, so here's somebody's asking, if one experienced an earlier trauma and this tragic incident triggered the old trauma, what is the best way to approach this? Excellent question. One of the, I was going to talk later about which subsets of children would be most at risk. and a previously traumatized individual would be more at risk for a subsequent trauma, even secondarily, even if they weren't in Meron. But just the fact that this happened is going to bring back memories of the prior trauma, and then could complicate their response. And then they need to process both traumas. They need to, again, in the manner and fashion I'm going to talk about soon, they need to process both of them. They need to be aware of how one is sort of piggybacking on the other. So their processing work is greater. And again, if it's insurmountable, please reach out. We'll give you further assistance. The others, as it's brought up, the other groups that I think we have to be careful about are the kids who've had pre-existing any kind of vulnerabilities, whether it's depression, anxiety, whether it's a sibling that's ill, or any of the other kind of stresses that make that potentially compromise our functioning, if in the context of that of those hardships, something like this happens, it's going to impact them upon them more intensely. And again, that's normal. These are all what we colloquially refer to as the abnormal reactions and abnormal situations, which are normal. Okay, another question, by the way, that I've gotten asked at other forums, and I want to bring up here, which is that this time in Israel, especially for some of the younger groups, is a time to nurture independence. We all know the age-old paradox of parenting, which is that, most of the time when we have something precious, if you own a precious piece of art, if you own an heirloom of some sort, you lock it in your safe, you hold on to it, you want to pass it on to future generations. Yet nothing is more precious to us than our children. And if we do our job right, they leave us. Our goal is to render them in such a way that they are capable of functioning on their own. That's our measure of success. And therefore, for many, this year in Israel is a chance and opportunity to be independent. And now, as a result of this tragedy, many of them are calling more and connecting more. And are we interfering with this nurturing of independence? Now, I would tell you in most instances, no. Our natural tendency when we're scared, when we're distressed, is to reach out to other people. I'll give you it may sound simplistic, but just an example. Imagine, for those of you in the New York City area, you're in a subway car and you're going from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and you have your earbuds in and you're reading and nobody's paying attention to anyone else, and the train screeches to a halt, the lights go off, and there's smoke in the car. Immediately everybody's going to start talking to each other, because we want human contact when we feel threatened. And it's very natural then, especially you as protective figures, that your children are going to reach out to you more. And I would expect that, and I think you should be flattered if they do. And don't get too upset if they don't. But I don't think this is going to interfere, because with the nurturing independence, because that's part of being independent, is to be able to function on your own. Also know when you need other people. We all need other people. So that's part of the nurturing of independence. But however, if your child was overly dependent, and if this is part of your concern, and this is what you were hoping to accomplish while they were in Israel, and you feel they were actually regressing, then again, you may have to be prepared to wean them from that contact. But certainly at this early point, I don't think that should be a major consideration. I think that it's important to help them and be in touch with them. And by the way, and this is one more point that I'm going to see. There's another chat, and I'm going to address it. The contact does not mean solving. There's no solution to this. Contact means knowing that they're not alone. The contact means to help the other person gain mastery over this. But don't look for solutions. I will tell you, and this, if there's anything you're hearing from me tonight, please make sure you hear this, that if someone is traumatized, it could be your child during this circumstances or any other kind of situation in the future, and they come to talk to you or they call you and they recount what they went through, and you do nothing else but attentively listen and validate how legitimate their response is, you have done therapy. And I will tell you, as a clinician, some people pay me some good money for this, that when it comes to these kind of traumatic events, very often that's all I do. Sometimes I feel like, why do they need me? I'm not offering them solutions. I don't have any brilliant insights, but I'm intently listening to them, and I'm it may be explaining to them how normal their responses are under these kind of circumstances, and they're experiencing tremendous relief. We were busy with that all year with the COVID-19, the OL trauma team. Much of what we did was just that, just listened. So listening, validating, if they're directly traumatized, loving them, caring for them is the therapy, not giving them explanations or solutions. Okay, one more. Okay, how do people know when a person, quote, should have been able to move on? So that's a very good question. And I don't like should questions, but especially in these situations, I mean, we should be good people and we should be observant people, but I don't think when it comes to emotions, we should. The most of the time, if we let nature run its course, if we let our emotional experiences unfold, we're doing the right thing. The should have, I would say, is when we should be concerned is if the responses are stagnant. Responses to trauma, responses to grief are progressive, painful, not always in a straight line, as I indicated earlier, but movement. It is and at the end of the day, post-trauma reactions and grief responses are growing experiences. So there should be not, again, and not after 5 days, more gradually over time. These experiences get integrated into our understanding of the world, integrated into our understanding of ourselves, integrated into our understanding of Hashem, of God. But there should be that kind of progressive movement. If there isn't, if the person weeks from now is exactly where they were today, if they're stuck, if they're in quicksand, then something is untoward. And that's the point where you would probably reach out to someone professionally and try to understand. But I'm telling you, that is the exception, not the rule. The rule is a gravitation towards health. The rule is a gravitation towards recovery. The other thing you need to be careful about in these kind of reactions is any kind of self-harmful or self-destructive behavior. I don't mean necessarily anything like suicide or something like that, but neglecting one's health, neglecting one's business, neglecting one's relationships, withdrawing, those kind of behaviors. Again, not momentarily, not at this early juncture, but on a more regular basis. Would be a way of telling whether the person is stuck. Okay, so let's go on with some other points. Again, thank you for these questions. They're really, as I said, many of them have anticipated what I'm going to be talking about, so I'm going to have to just jump around. Another thing, by the way, to keep in mind as your child acclimates to or adjusts to this to integrating this experience is that the reaction to grief and post-trauma reactions are an in and out experience. You can't, let's put it, for the most part, you can't, if it's affecting you, you can't ignore it totally, but you can't drown in it either. And I used an expression there. I was speaking to some people affected by these events, and I said to them, you visit your grief. And someone came up to me afterwards and told me that his mother died when he was 6. And that's exactly it. He never heard anybody say it before, but that's what it is. We visit it. But we also resume our routine. This is extremely important part of recovery from trauma. Because again, let's take a break for a second and analyze what's trauma. Trauma is a break from the predictability. It's a break from the script of life. We all expected, everybody who went to Meron expected to go and have an extremely uplifting experience and come back that night to wherever setting. Nobody anticipated this kind of danger and harm to occur. And as Dr. Rabbi Liebtag said earlier, especially on this joyous occasion, very reminiscent of Aaron's sons who were killed during a very celebratory event. And nobody expected that. So it's a break in our routine. It's a break we expected. People on 9/11 went to the office expecting a regular, ordinary, boring day at work, had no expectation for airplanes coming crashing into their building. So by resuming the routine, by reclaiming the predictable, we remind ourselves that these are exceptions, not the rules. So whereas while our children in the yeshivas and the seminaries and the colleges have to process this and have to discuss it with the professionals, with their parents, they also have to go back to class. They also have to resume their routine as we do. because that's part of the healing. So you have to help our kids integrate that. And maybe after you had a phone conversation during this was processed, to say to them, what did you cover today in this class? What part of the Talmud did you review today? Where are you going to be for the weekend? And by the way, also something that's very important is, just because this tragedy happened, and even if it happened and it happened to a family member, I mean, to a friend or a close associate, you're allowed to enjoy life. That's important as well. One of the, I would have to say, recurrent questions we got at the end of last week, it was Lag BaOmer. Typically, Jewish day schools in particular have, and yeshivas have outings and fun events. And this was after a year of being cooped up with masks and plexiglass, and the kids really needed it. And is it okay? Is it okay to do something recreational like that? And I think it is. It's part of life. And by the way, interestingly enough, for those who are grieving loved ones who died or close friends or et cetera, that very often, and again, this is a whole topic unto itself, but those who are leaving this world, when people have a chance to say goodbye to loved ones who die, usually the very last message they give the survivors is, go on living, have fun, get remarried. They want us to live. They want us to enjoy life as much as possible, and they're allowed. It's okay for them. This is a special year and time in Israel for them to go out and gorge themselves in falafel and shawarma, and to have fun with their friends, to engage in sports and recreational activities as well. And then that doesn't mean that they can't other times think about what happened and think about the pain and visit it. Especially, okay, I see there's some other additional chats and Q&A, so let me try to address them. Okay, so again, people are asking about why did this happen? And first of all, even if there is someone who is equipped to answer that question, it ain't me, as Bob Dylan said. I certainly cannot address that. I'm not sure if anybody can or should at this point. It's interesting. A colleague of mine was telling me about a group that she was participating in, and someone was asking again and again, it's so meaningless, what's the meaning? It's so meaningless, what's the meaning? And she asked me, how would I answer that question? And I said, that's the meaning, the meaninglessness. We can't understand. We can't understand. It's beyond our comprehension. I often, when I'm struggling with people in the throes of grief and trauma, and when they raise these questions, I like to quote the legendary Kotzker Rebbe, who said, I could never believe in a God I could understand. I don't think we can understand, but if there is a way to understand, it's certainly under the rubric of it's out of my skill set. Okay, so how can we do about somebody who's neglecting themselves after loss or having difficulty with sleeping and eating? Those are two separate questions, okay? Someone who is more deliberately neglecting themselves is very different than someone who, especially at this very early stage, is having trouble with sleeping and eating. For example, and I know this is going to be very painful probably to hear, but one of the things I've observed is, we shouldn't know from, but a mother who loses a child, usually in the early stages, doesn't want to eat. And sometimes what they'll tell me is, my child's not eating, I'm not going to eat. They ultimately do eat, but that's very difficult if it's very much on your mind, you have trouble sleeping, eating at this early stage, or if it's someone very close to you. That's normal. I mean, this is something that you can't just get out of your mind. Now, what I was alluding to before, which was I was suggesting may not be the healthiest type of grief, is the person who 3 months later is neglecting his health, has a heart condition, is eating a lot of cholesterol and smoking cigarettes, is not going into his job, is just jeopardizing income. Those kind of more almost, I don't want to say deliberate, but engineered infliction of self-harm, and I don't mean, again, suicide, I mean, but harmful experiences, is very different than the person in the throes of early grief and trauma who has trouble sleeping and eating, and many people have trouble sleeping and eating at this point. I've had trouble sleeping because of what's happened, and I'm grateful that I do, because it means that I'm connected, and I think it speaks to the sensitivity of the person who's not sleeping or eating. Okay, here's a very good question and comment I get asked. If my child is typically not the type to share feelings and information in the situation, should I ask for questions? Directly try to use my intuition. So always use your intuition as a parent, especially if it's a mother asking this question. Always use your intuition, because your connection to your child, nobody else. I mean, maybe someday a future spouse will, but your connection to your child is unique and unparalleled. And please trust your intuition. But here's the question: is there are certain children, as there are adults, who are just not, who feel things very profoundly, but have a very hard time expressing it or sharing it. Sometimes it's because they are very emotional people, and they feel it so intensely that defies words. But other times they're by nature not expressive people, and therefore their feelings, not so their subduedness, or their, I don't know if there's such a word, or their quietness, is not because they're not feeling it, it's because they don't know how to express it. The worst thing to do for someone like that is to ask them, interrogate them, because that increases the pressure and makes them internalize all the more. What the best thing to do for someone, if that's what you suspect with your child, is to create a milieu or a setting where it'll more naturally come out. So it's before bedtime and you're sitting together and you're giving your child a little back rub, and you're talking yourself about things yourself, but you don't ask, but you create a very relaxed atmosphere where the child can sort of stick their toe in water. You take a walk on a beautiful day by a lake, and just create settings that optimize the likelihood. Or you give them another context other than speaking to express their feelings. You might say to them, you know what, why don't you write something on the computer about what it's like and what it's like for you? Or for that matter, sometimes give them a piece, a crayon and a piece of paper or an easel and a brush, and let them paint it. And actually, by the way, very young children who are engaging in imaginary play very often will express it through their imaginary play. So find other mediums or ways for your child to express their concerns. Okay, I've seen the Q&A. There's some questions. Let me just okay. Oh, this was asked in both settings. Okay. Okay, we have a little time left, so I want to get to just some more quickly in points. By the way, symbolic gestures. If your child is having a hard time, and again, they're 6,000 miles away, you can't give them that hug, you can't give them that kiss, you can't just sit next to them, you can't take them on that walk. And so what can you do? So, send them a treat, send them a bouquet of flowers for Shabbat. These kind of symbolic gestures. Just an emoji with a heart or something like that. These small gestures, send them a tape of a song that what you think will hit home and connect with them. So those kind of symbolic gestures are very helpful. Okay, another interesting question, point that comes up with these matters, and I think needs its due consideration, is the station in life that your children are in, if they are spending that year in Israel, which is that they're transitioning into adulthood. They're at that sort of like, in between stage, that they're leaving childhood and entering adulthood. And sometimes you're not too sure even how to. And by the way, a significant amount of that growth is occurring during this year. And are you going to talk to them in the classical kind of parent-child manner, or are you going to talk to them as an older adult to a younger adult? And that's something you have to gauge at this point. And by the way, even if you started sensing that transition and you started sensing that change in your relationship, a trauma of this magnitude can sometimes affect a regression, and your child may go back to the sort of previous level of connection. So because they're at that in-between stage, you have to sort of gauge how and in which fashion you're going to speak to your child. Okay, 1 second. Okay, I can't, all right, let me go. That's, again, there was a question about previous traumas and it's affecting the current trauma. And again, it means addressing both. I will give you an example. sometimes after a tragedy, we have to, as the trauma team, we do a debriefing with either EMTs, Hatzalah, with police officers, with firefighters, even with burial societies, with Chevra Kadisha, we've had to do debriefings. And what typically happens in these groups is that multiple traumas. So in other words, if we're doing, let's say, debriefing with Hatzalah, with the EMTs and about, let's say, again, a tragic event, an accident, a drowning or something like that, all the ones that occurred over the last few years will come back to them and they process them. They process it together. So we don't only address this one, we address the others, and that's the manner of, that's how you deal with re-traumatization. One of the questions I got asked, and I think we sort of asked it already before, which is how do I know if my child needs more services? And first of all, you'll know, you're the parent, but again, if they're stuck, if they just can't move, if it's interfering significantly with their daily functioning, I'm sure everybody is sort of functioning on 4 cylinders now, but if it's significantly interfering with their functioning, that may be the case. And again, all the institutions have superb people at their disposal, and just ask the institution, have some one of them look at them and look them over. It's harmless, and it can maybe rest. You can rest assured. One more thing I think that you have to be aware of is that their return home, and for many, their return home may be pretty soon because we're coming towards the end of the academic year. Sometimes they may recoup and get and function well, and then coming back and being able now to hug their parents or being in close proximity to the people that they most readily associate as protective figures may bring it all back. I can well imagine, and again, I often like to quote the great philosopher Yogi Berra, who would say that predicting is very difficult, especially about the future. And I could well imagine that the reunions after this event, especially those most profoundly affected, are going to be especially tearful and especially emotional, and that's okay. And there may be a time when some of the trauma may get revisited. I would urge you, and I'm only talking as a psychologist now, I'm not talking from a political or leadership perspective, but try to stay away from fault finding, looking for culprits, looking for, from a pragmatic view, why this happened and were people at fault. There's a lot of this abounding on the internet. And again, this is also, by the way, a wonderful opportunity to teach ourselves and our children how to be selective about videos and newscasts and information and statements and blogs and vlogs that bombard us. But I don't think it's going to be helpful for the healing process. I'm hopeful that responsible people who are equipped and trained to accomplish this will do just that, but it's not our position, and I don't think it is helpful. Certainly not for the bereaved, but also even for everybody who's traumatized. Now is a time for healing, not for fault finding. Let me conclude with just we have a Jewish tradition that we have a Jewish tradition that we should end on a positive note, and so I'm going to do just that, and that is to trust yours and your child's resilience. People ask me sometimes, how can you do this kind of work? Doesn't it get to you? And it does. I want it to, because otherwise I'm disconnected. But one of the answers I give people is I don't just see tragedy. I see incredible resilience, strength, brilliant responses. I see connections, love, and between people. And all this sort of mitigates the horror as it is healing. So trust your children and their strength. Trust your children, their resilience, trust in the institutions. This is an unthinkable horror. It's confusing and it's destabilizing, but we have a lot going for us. And trust that and allow that to become part of your understanding. And again, these are, and I'll repeat what I said earlier, but I think it's important for ourselves and for our children. One of the questions I got asked again over these last few days was, and I remember if I referenced this already, but if I did, I apologize. Someone asked me, how do we prevent this event from defining that very special year for our children. In other words, certainly as our children will grow up and when they think back over their lives, this year or years in Israel are very unique and special, and ones that they're going to think back on in terms of how they understand how they evolved into who they are. Why should this year be quote unquote defined, as the question was asked to me, by the tragedy? And my answer was it should be. It should be, because it is. It's an overriding event, but it's not just a tragedy. It's the unity, it's the strength, it's the faith, all that came along with it that's going to be integrated and understood by all of us, and will be an aspect of this year that our children had, and with the hope and prayer that the future years that our children have and the future stays in Israel will be devoid of such hardship and pains and challenges. I thank you for listening. We as the OL Trauma team are available to all of you. If you have more specific questions or concerns, please either email me or contact OL through OL's access to OL's website.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Blumenthal. Thank you, all the participants who joined us today, and thank those of you who submitted questions. If you do feel that you need some guidance, Dr. Blumenthal's email is in the chat. We also have treatment centers both in Brooklyn and Far Rockaway. You can reach OHEL by calling 800-603-OHEL. OHEL is 6435. Again, want to reiterate that we're here to help. Certainly, as we leave tonight, our tefillot are with those 45 families that are sitting Shiva, and for the many that were injured. And so we hope and pray for their quick recovery and for the rest to have a nechama. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you on behalf of OHEL. Have a good night. And remember to fill out the survey when you sign off. Have a good night.